Welcome everyone to this special episode of the series that we are running called Venture Capital Debunked and Demystified. Every weekend, we actually talk to a VC in this space. We have talked to Matt Harris from Bain Capital. We have talked to Alex Baker from Relay Ventures. And especially we are talking to people who have done fintech investments, who have a lot of experience, helping companies grow in this space. So today I am very fortunate to have Bala, whom I have known for a while now. And maybe, let's start with a hi from Bala first.
Hey, Amit, how are you? Hi, everyone.
Good. All right. So we thought that one of the segments within fintech which does not get a lot of attention is actually B2B fintech. More specifically, we wanted to focus on B2B fintech software companies. So largely our discussion will be around that. We will be touching various aspects of it in terms of what are the different segments, what are the challenges, what are the things that you need to consider to grow such companies, what are the success factors, are there kind of, some examples both from India as well as global, which can actually throw some light in terms of what kind of companies have made it big in the space. And of course, a lot of stuff on investments as well. But before that, let me just tell you a little bit about Bala. So Bala is quite familiar with this space. He has actually invested in a range of B2B fintech companies in the past. He actually started as a Wall Street analyst and then has been involved in very senior positions at two startups. One of them got an exit. And his last role before Arkam Ventures was at Kalari Capital as a partner. And that's where I got in touch with Bala, and we have known each other since then. So maybe Bala, since this is a new fund, and I think some of the audience may not be very familiar with it, do you mind just explaining a little bit about Arkam Ventures as well as how you chose that name? I think the name is also very interesting.
Sure, Amit. And it's always good to see you. Arkam in Sanskrit means limitless or boundaryless. I mean, it's a kind of an ethos that we thought stood very strongly in our minds in terms of what we're looking for with our founders and the types of companies and the types of solutions that they have. Quick correction in terms of the fund size. So it is a $100 million fund. Our first close, we have about $45 million in committed capital. So we're halfway there. The fund is a early stage fund, Series A, Series B investments. We are focused on 4 sectors, and the thesis of the fund is actually technology innovation for Middle India. So my partner Rahul, who is from Helion Ventures, and I, we're very focused on this particular thesis. And what that really is all about is we feel the biggest venture outcomes over the next 15 years are going to come from startups using technology to solve for big issues faced by middle class India. This is people making between 3 lakhs and 20 lakhs a year in family income. And being India, that's a very large segment. It's about 400 million people. But the main point is there are about 40 million small businesses and these consumers who have very special needs and very special requirements in terms of their products and services. And whatever you build for the top portion of the pyramid in India usually takes another $50, $75 million to retool by the time you're actually able to sell to this segment. And we were really going to find entrepreneurs, and we are finding great founders from scratch who are building product for this market. 4 verticals: financial services, healthcare, food and grocery, and logistics. And we have a long fintech background, and fintech is a very, very big part of the fund.
Right. And what Bala and me also did, in terms of sort of prepping up for this, is that we looked at about 31 companies from India in the B2B fintech software space and about 24 from global marketplace. So we will be kind of taking some examples during this. So my next question, Bala, to you is that the B2B fintech opportunity, it seems like it's huge, like globally. But what are the drivers, and can you tell us why this space is growing and what's happening in this space really?
So I'll split it into 2 parts. One is the very short term. I think whatever is happening with COVID is a global phenomenon, and whether it's our startups or anybody in Europe or the US, I think the short term is very challenging. It is a time where people are worried about cash burn. And Amit, I know you had a question. We can talk later about how do you even deal with a circumstance like this. But so the short term, next 6 to 9 months is going to be very challenging. But if you set that aside for a minute, we think B2B fintech, and if you were to define it, and Amit, I know you wanted to be more specific about it. If you're talking about solutions being built by startups for the financial services market, which includes banks and insurance companies, etc., or in our definition at least, solutions that are very finance specific in a given vertical. I can give you 2 separate examples of that. We think you're almost going into a golden age for this. And the reason for that is primarily because while there's been a lot of noise and success in B2C fintech, on the B2B side, almost most of the transaction processes, whether it's lending, whether it's insurance, whether it is regulatory, capital markets tech, all of it is running on 30, 40-year-old legacy systems somewhere along the chain. It doesn't matter if you have a very fancy front-end UI, but somewhere along is a creaky old system that was written maybe 20 years ago. And right. I think more and more companies are increasingly realizing that to compete going forward, they are going to have to retool this entire thing. And either startups are beginning to own big portions of that value chain, or as a defensive measure, companies are beginning to acquire the right kind of startups to fix this. So we just think that over the next 10 years, you're going to see a lot more of B2B fintech companies solving for this plumbing, whether it's in India or globally.
Right, right. And yet at the same time, given the work that we do at MEDICI, the sort of bridge that we have built between banks, FIs, and B2B fintech software companies, we've seen a lot of challenges, right? A lot of problems that fintech startups in this space face in terms of scaling their companies. We have also seen that it does not get the same kind of VC love that B2C companies get. Not generalizing, but kind of many cases that I have seen. Is it from an investment perspective? Is it that because of the nuances of the segment, it's kind of very risky to invest in this space? It's kind of very hard to judge companies. What's the thing? So let's start with the challenges, problems that fintech face, and then you tell me about the investment side from your perspective.
Yeah. Look, I think in terms of challenges, I wouldn't say that, people believe, at least a lot of the investors that I know do believe that this is a space with a lot of potential. Now, the one big difference that between a B2C company and a B2B company is, as a B2B fintech company, actually there aren't too many places to hide. What I mean by that is, as a B2C company, you can come up with your app downloads, you can talk about the number of consumers you have well before you monetize, right? You can show various traction metrics. But if you're a company in the B2B fintech space, and I think it very quickly comes down to being able to solve something very critical for possibly large enterprises, and the measuring stick that I would use or anybody else would use is really what often is a challenge for B2B fintech company in the early years, which is, can you crack open an enterprise sales cycle, right? And can you actually convince a large corporation or a mid-sized corporation that you truly have innovative technology that can still check the boxes of security and compliance, as well as have a level of stickiness that they begin to do more and more with you. So the 2 or 3 areas where I feel people struggle a lot more initially tends to be in acquiring enterprise customers, and once you land, being able to expand. But that is where your product stickiness and the value of your product needs to come in. And the really successful companies have learned the art of owning a subsegment and then broadening out from there into adjacent processes, especially in B2B SaaS, where your account expansion and your account order value keeps increasing, which does world of good to your monthly revenue run rate. So there are several different challenges in going to market, and especially in financial services. We can talk a lot more about that because I did that for a living for a while, in terms of trying to take this to market. I think within India, the other challenge would really be there is a concern on whether India can be a large enough market for a B2B fintech company. I actually think it depends on what area you want to go after in India. But given some unique characteristics in India, I also am seeing a lot of Indian B2B fintech companies are well positioned to take what they've learned in India and go global. So there is a lot of opportunity. On the VC side, I think there are several VCs who know the space, who are interested. It clearly is not as sexy as the B2C side. But given the recent exits that we should probably talk about, I think there is enough interest in the space. When I say exits, I mean on a global basis.
Right. Can you, I know that you worked at some B2B companies in the past. Can you give an example of, sort of a win from, like a difficult situation that you were faced with, and then you came up with something which was very interesting and worked out?
So, in my last job, when I should say last to last job, before I was in the venture space. So I used to run global sales and marketing for a company called Amba Research. And Amba Research is a financial research analytics company. And interestingly, I was mentioning to Amit that I joined that company in 2008, right at the pits of the last big global recession. Yeah. And as a young startup, trying to go and sell to global banks in New York, in London, Amsterdam, Tokyo, which is really where most of our customers were, and we sold it out of India, was very challenging because it was an environment where the person we met didn't really have a job the next time we would ring them up. So the real question was, how do you really take a solution from a young startup and actually go to market on a global basis? And we learned several lessons, some of it the hard way. But first thing we really learned was at times like this, even during the COVID environment, what is really important is, being able to build a very high quality team. So right now, I know a lot of my startups everybody is in a little bit of a hunker down mode. But one piece of advice that I've always given them is, if you can afford it, this is a great time to find 2 or 3 best-in-class salespeople, especially on a global basis, because they will set the tone for you as you come out of this recession. It's not quantity, but quality that matters. And the second thing is staying in front of customers. So one of the things that we did in 2009 and 2010 was really take out a much broader thought leadership message to our large financial services customers, the Barclays and the JP Morgans of the world, where we talk to them about what type of research and analytics can change their entire process. As before we were doing 300K deals, when we came out of this environment, we started doing $1, $2, $3 million deals because we transformed the positioning and the thought leadership and the value proposition of what we had. And a lot of times, environments like this are a great time to amp up your communication to very senior people because they have more time. And they are also looking to figure out how to take their company forward. So I think talking a lot more to your customers at a different level and setting the stage for a sales cycle that may be 9 months down the road with high quality salespeople is one example of what you should be doing right now.
Right. And one of the startups I was talking to, they made a very interesting point that while COVID-19 crisis is throwing up all sorts of challenges, but what they're also realizing is that some of the local vendors had a very sort of unfair advantage because they would go and meet the senior bankers all the time, and so they would always win the deals. But during this time, everybody is sort of virtual, right? So yeah, it provides it's kind of a leveler, right? That you don't lose against an unfair advantage of kind of meeting people.
No, that's very true. Very true.
Yeah, yeah. And you talked about certain areas, right? So maybe we should go specific. I think that's what we decided about the session, that let's talk about the specific segments and subsegments which are there. So the way that we look at it from a MEDICI perspective about B2B fintech software is that there are 6 or 7 areas which have a lot of fintech startups. So I'm just going to define them one by one. So there is this space called financial infrastructure APIs or fintech APIs providers. Setu and M2P Yap, are great examples of that. Then there are loan engines, tools, loan data, LOS, LMS systems for underwriting and portfolio management, and so on. So there is this whole area of lending software. Then there is one of our favorite, I know for you as well, eKYC, AML, CFT, and RegTech, where companies like ScienceG are there. Then there are capital market technology companies. There was a great company called Simility. They're still around, but they have been bought by PayPal. So that was a very sort of successful exit from the Indian startup scene. Then there are insurance infrastructure API companies which are emerging. Like example is Discovery. We talked to them on one of the other shows that we have. Then there are some more sort of horizontal offerings such as conversational UI, chatbots, and so on and so forth. So my question to you, Bala, is that amongst all these segments, are there ones which are kind of more appealing to you, your favorites, or how do you kind of look at these segments overall in terms of market opportunity?
Right, and those are all. That's a pretty good way to think about the market space, Amit. So the way we think about it is, look, financial services at the end of the day, is probably inherently way more digital than other verticals. But when you look at the B2B side, it is probably still left in it's about 15, 20 years behind. So let's just talk a minute about what are the hot spaces globally, purely in terms of exits, right? I mean, if you look at, Visa and Plaid and MasterCard and FinCity, they were big exits, Galileo that was recently acquired by Sophie. And then you've also seen a bunch of other areas where E-Trade has just been sold recently. If you ask the question why, it goes back to the beginning of the conversation, which is there are large pools of money in terms of business profits out there for a Visa and a MasterCard. For example, Visa's got a $300 billion market cap, which need to be protected against encroachment from new vendors. And these vendors have done an amazing job of trying to solve for the archaic nature of the old systems. So when we look at India, we really think that there is clearly an advantage Indian B2B fintech companies have that others don't have globally. And one big advantage they have is tremendous familiarity with an API-led ecosystem, whether it was starting with an Aadhaar, eKYC, moving on to DigiLocker, to our current health stack. There's a whole generation of founders and startups that have been building tools around a mobile and an API-based ecosystem. So what Setu is doing, for example, is very, very interesting, which is in an Indian context, try to be the giant in terms of providing ready-to-use APIs for any financial institution, for everything from tolls to collections to etc. So that is certainly a very, very interesting space. But the challenge in B2B fintech overall is, I don't think you can be the fifth player in doing the same thing, expecting to have a very large outcome. I mean, as a business, as a founder. And what tends to happen is large customers coalesce around a certain market leader for various reasons. One, you don't get fired for buying the market leader. But second, also, that that company is now going to survive, and they are going to be able to put in place the right kind of security protocols and really survive for you as a large enterprise. So one of the things we look for, and you talked about Signsy, what Signsy has done is a phenomenal job on the onboarding segment, right? They're using AI, they're using machine vision to really take a very cumbersome onboarding process for Indian banks, which used to take 3-4 weeks, and get that done in a day or two, in some cases in a few hours. But you've gone from a back room full of 600, 700 people into almost a no-touch digital API-driven system that is now giving you this output. And if you look at Signsy, I would say they've got a good shot at becoming the market share leader in India if they already aren't one, or every major bank uses them. But the same technology, when they go global now, they've got a couple of different advantages. They can point to the volumes they're doing in India, they can point to the API infrastructure in India, and they can actually point to the kind of technology usage here. But they have their own set of challenges when they go abroad, which we talked about from a sales and marketing standpoint. So right now, to summarize, we are pretty interested in people trying to solve large Indian problems using an API stack in India. Within that, we think eKYC is interesting. We actually find the whole area of digital fraud and insurance around, digital fraud insurance to be quite interesting. There are companies that we know building out of India for a global market. And clearly the whole area around collections, AI-driven collections in lending is a piece of technology that if you can do a great job in India, you can take it across Southeast Asia as well. So these are some of the areas where we think the volumes are there to build a market leader.
Right, right. And that is a good segue into kind of, understanding what does success mean, right? So, basically some companies have IPO'd. We talked about a few exits like Plaid and Finicity. There are some who are growing their revenues very rapidly in terms of ARRs and all that. But as an investor, what is the metrics or what are the success factors, the common denominators that you look for in such companies? And maybe, if you can give some examples of Indian companies and global companies, it will be great.
Yeah, see, I think in terms of what we look for, especially we are early stage investors, okay? So when you've got a young company, what we are really looking for, especially in the B2B side, is does this founding team have a product that is truly cutting edge, where they can actually, it's good enough where your sales cycles in large enterprises are short for two reasons. Your sales cycles are short because the product almost sells itself, which is really important, assuming you've got somewhat of a visionary buyer in the early stage. And the second reason is that the product is actually very easy to deploy and has a certain sticky factor when you're able to get in quickly and stay there. So we do a heck of a lot of referencing by talking to customers around these two aspects. Okay, so that's part one. And part two, which we really like to see in the data is, so one is, can this company, go out and sign, and since we are trying to retain the discussion purely to B2B Fintech SaaS, let's assume it's enterprise SaaS, right? Does this company have the ability to have the domino effect in a given subsegment? So let's say that you're doing RegTech. If you went and sold to JP Morgan, are you good enough that from a Barclays to a Wells Fargo, everybody looks at you and says, look, we got to have this product, or at least half of them look at you, where you're able to quickly become a category leader, right? And we look for clues on how this happens. And the way we look for clues is two ways. One is, are you able to sell to some enterprises? And second, do you have retention metrics? Especially in enterprise SaaS, it's not as if customers are going to put you in and take you out the next day. But if you're having churn at that level, I think that's a very big red flag. So we look at retention, and probably the most important thing that I'm looking for is your account expansion. Are you able to get into a customer, and within 6 months, are we seeing a lot more MRR coming out of that particular account? Because it means another division has seen this. It means, you're having broken in through the door. Your cost of customer acquisition is now paying off across other divisions in a large enterprise, where you're growing, 4x in the first year, you're growing 4x in the second year, because you're not really going out and trying to sign up, brand new customers every time, but every customer you sign up is now generating a lot more, higher value, higher margin repeats in the enterprise business. And that's kind of really important, right? So in terms of examples, I think a really good example of a lot of what I have said, but in a different space, and which is kind of different, would be somebody like a Postman, what they've done with the API-led stack out of India. Clearly, that is not necessarily enterprise. Enterprises do use it. It is also some of the smaller companies, but it's very much doable out of India. But on a global basis, I was a pretty big fan of the way Stripe has gone about their business from an API perspective. I'm pretty big fan of the way Plaid has kind of built it, so on and so forth. Yeah. Amit, you can hear me?
Oh, sorry, there's some issue. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so yeah, from my side, I would add some examples maybe. So I think in each of the areas, right? So financial infrastructure APIs, fintech APIs, I think we have talked about Plaid, Finicity. I just wrote an article that why Visa and MasterCard were so interested in those, as the old payment rails are changing into open banking rails and real-time payments, and from a card form factor to mobile payments and tokenization and so on and so forth. There's a need for Visa and MasterCard to remain relevant and stay in the middle, the core business that they had built. And in my opinion, actually, they are the original, the OG B2B fintech success stories, Visa and MasterCard. So they they're acquiring Plaid and Finicity sort of, completes that cycle. There's also TrueLayer and Synapse FI and a few others in that area. We also talked about Setu and Yap. I think in terms of loan engines, loan tools, we have seen things like Credit Karma, 100 Credits, which are quite popular. eKYC, MLCFT, I think Trulio, Onfido, Theta Ray, Tukitaki, these companies have done very well.
Yeah.
We talked about capital market.
So Amit, I'll make one point before I forget.
Yeah.
Though you talked about Credit Karma and you talked about loan engines, and this may not necessarily fit exactly in the box the way you've defined it, but one area that excites us a lot as investors is really the verticalization of B2B fintech. Okay, what I mean by that is, if you take a country like India, it is so broken in terms of areas like working capital management in a large area like, for example, agri, right? Or if you were to take financing in healthcare, or you were to take leasing in healthcare. So each of these areas has so many broken processes, and they are so large that we actually think, just like you have somebody like a Setu going, totally horizontal, or somebody like a Sainzi trying to do this with onboarding. We see very large companies emerging in verticalization globally, right? And so, for example, my partner Rahul led an investment in a company called Jai Kisan, which is really rethinking the entire agri supply chain, because like in every vertical in India, the biggest issue is cash flow management and working capital, which results in massive inefficiencies that is just blocking output. And there are these young fintech companies that can truly make a difference. So I would kind of club them in terms of the areas that I think there's a lot of opportunity.
No, absolutely. So B2B fintech software, I think, can be extended to not just those companies who sell to banks and FIs, but also to other technology companies, other consumer tech companies, even like say software to the value chain, like the example of Jai Kisan you gave, which is doing fantastic work in the agri value chain.
Yep.
Just a couple of more examples, and then we move on to the next question. That there is a company called UiPath, which is an RPA software company, which has obviously grown very big. That's a great example in this space. And then in insurance, we have seen this company called Shift Technology. It provides fraud detection for insurance. There are B2C companies now which are forming, like, these B2B arms. For example, Zongen created a separate technology arm called ZA Tech. In fact, I don't know if you noticed or not, but Ant Financial actually changed their name from Ant Financial to Ant Technology. And they have a big unit which is actually going to banks and FIs and saying, we have done this 310 loans in China. We have this amazing piece of software which works at scale. It has all the checks and balances. Why don't you use it to sort of give loans in Thailand and Indonesia? So
actually, the point that you made, the space is getting also complex. And so one of the things that when we look at young companies over here, and especially in fintech, where you always have at the back of your mind, is India a large enough market? You take the RPA companies, right? The robotic process automation companies. They are all over financial services organizations in the US. And in all these areas that you talked about, whether it's RegTech, it's compliance, it is KYC, it could be even lending processes. You can have a company like Automation Anywhere show up and say, look, I've got a toolkit and I can model this process and I can do RPA around it. Or you have a young company that's actually understood the process and has built a very specific solution that still scales. And that's going to be the battle going forward, which is, can young fintech B2B companies own a process so well that it's a no-brainer for a financial institution to use that, versus what their IT group is saying, look, we've already paid it for an RPA license, let's go out and custom build all these processes. It's an age-old battle, but we see that playing out again right now.
Right. Absolutely. In fact, in some cases where we were working with a bank or FI to sort of do a vendor selection process, not really like the traditional vendor selection processes, which were more about how big is the company and how many people and all of that, but really about the technology capability and how soon the product can be integrated from a security and other aspects. So we had a very interesting thing. So we had like these Finacles and Oracles of the world competing for that on one end. Then there were RPA companies, as you were saying, and then there were like these young fintech companies which are also competing for the same thing. The only difference was somebody was saying, okay, I can also do it. And then somebody was saying, no, this is all I do. This is my life's work.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that made a lot of difference, I think, in that selection.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you that this is like the question that I have been asked like 500 times. I'm sure 1,000 times to you, that is Indian market big enough to make a B2B fintech software a success story? Like we have seen in B2C, it's happening a lot. It's a large market. It provides that kind of headway. But what happens to a B2B fintech software company after a while is that they are like, say 30 or 40 banks which really buy software meaningfully, right? The dollar size is big enough.
Yeah.
And in that also the sales cycles are long. Sometimes they're not able to get a very good contract, a large size contract. So after a while, they start feeling like, where am I going? Should I go to Singapore, Southeast Asia? Should I go to Middle East? And then they started sort of expanding the wings. But they soon realized that it's not easy to sell into a different market unless you're there, unless you know people. Maybe that's changing right now. But what's your take on this entire sort of dynamics which is there?
See, that's the reality of the market, where I do think there are 30, 40 banks in India. And let's just break this into a couple of pieces, right? One is, I don't think the Indian, and I mean, I have a good friend of mine who is probably one of the better salespeople I know, who's run sales for SAP, who's run sales for Apple, who's run sales for a lot of enterprises in India. And India is a very, very hard market to sell into because, frankly, enterprises are not as, they're not as interested in buying into a vision and paying premium for it to be ahead. They're much more, shall I say, cost conscious, right? So a couple of things tend to happen with B2B fintech startups in India. One is you go in, like you said, with a certain offering, and right in the beginning, I think you kind of get beaten up on the price. And what I've found, the biggest mistakes happen is in contracting, interestingly, right? So you agree to a certain price point, the word gets around the market, and you're pretty much stuck with that price point forever. And there are ways to get around that. Maybe we don't have time on the call here. But the second part, I think, is when we look at it as an investor, we very much are thinking about the underlying tech, because financial services is digital. And can this product be taken out of India, and how successful will it be? I mean, we're not so bothered about the fact that it's hard to go abroad. I think if you have the right product and the right founder, you can be successful. You've seen Freshworks do it. You've seen a lot of companies out of India do it. But where companies lose a lot of years, not even months, is in the mistakes you make when you're trying to go to market, when you're trying to go abroad, in the way you hire and the way you stick around with salespeople and the way you kind of put together your marketing team, your thought leadership team. We think companies lose 18, 24 months in the mistakes and retool, and sometimes get hurt so badly they come back to India. And part of our job as investors is to provide that support. And it's still very hard, but I think there is a much better pathway today than there was 5 years ago.
Right. I also saw something very interesting that, a couple of examples that you were talking about. One of the founders told me that what they do is they first go and try to understand the problems that a bank is facing and try to do a lot of, like some custom work for them, like in terms of automation, so that if they are going to use their APIs, it should work in a proper fashion. So they actually ended up not just sort of automating stuff on the bank side, but also making some money in that process. And then they were able to plug in their product, which worked much, much better sort of going forward. So I thought that that's a good area, but it has its pitfall as well, because as a product company, should you get distracted, or I don't know what's your view on that?
I think it's got a lot of issues, right? I mean, I think this is one of the most challenging parts as a founder when you come in, is you essentially have, you probably found your first large enterprise customer. There is a early adopter on the other side who's now going to get an arm and a leg because he's allowed you into their bank, which is fair. I think you do that for your early adopter. But when you start repeating these habits, which is, there are so many B2B fintech companies or generally SaaS companies I've met where even today, they've got multiple instances running for different banks, where somebody says, hey, I will not over my dead body if you want me to be on the cloud. I want my private cloud. And then exactly what you said, I need these custom code built to tie back into the backend order entry system. I think it's all okay within reason, but when that becomes the culture from a sales perspective, where you're selling pretty much anything that the customer wants to buy, I think it's very, very hard to scale, and your costs begin to mount because you got to maintain different versions of code, and you're trying essentially, you really become a custom shop, and that's not something that scales very well.
Right. Actually, a related question. I know we are kind of running tight on time, but I think this is a very sort of often asked question that should you, as a fintech, B2B fintech software company, as you're growing, should you go very broad and start kind of dealing with 5, 6 things? We have seen very successful examples of that, such as Customer XPS, which has, a fraud product, cross-channel sales product, and so on and so forth. And they have kind of, build a good revenue pipeline doing that. Or should you focus on just one thing? And I guess there comes more challenges that you will often run out in a market because there won't be many buyers after a while. So what's your advice to companies? Should they go too broad? And at what stage should they start thinking about going broad, if at all?
See, my recommendation always is you need to prove that your product has stickiness with a certain customer segment. Okay, you might just say, hey, look, I'm doing fraud detection for 10 banks, right? But if you've done a really good job, I think the next step for you is product expansion, often within those 10 accounts. You will find those opportunities. But we have never really seen a successful company that stopped with one product in a given segment. I'm talking about a sub-segment, and really scaled very well, because the value in a B2B SaaS business is the land and expand, where you have to be able to do this. Because let's say you're just doing fraud management, there are n number of adjacencies to that within a large bank, that you'll get either called by a different business unit, you'll get called by their legal team to solve something else, all of which can be productized and packaged. And now you can go back to their competitor and sell product A plus product A plus product B. So we see both hand in hand. Initially, you start out with a product, but your product roadmap based on customer input very much involves having adjacency both at the process level and at the product level, without which I don't think you can scale very well.
Right. And this is really my last question. I think a lot of people are watching this show live on Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as YouTube. And there's something that I just noticed. So I'm going to ask, so what is your kind of advice for B2B fintech companies in India? Should they, during this crisis, sort of hunker down, maybe reduce costs by sort of, defocusing on certain areas? Or should they, do something else? Is there a hack? Are there pieces of advice that you would like to give, which sort of B2B fintech companies should do right now? Because I think it's very challenging, right? It's hard to sell, hard to kind of conserve the cash.
Yeah, I would put it in two categories. One, clearly, you got to, I don't know the precise nature of each company's situation naturally, but there is prudence required in terms of how you manage your cash. And I don't think anybody they don't need to be told more. They're getting that advice from every investor they have on their board, etc. But my personal experience has been, having been an operator on that side, has been you can go overboard with this, right? I think without spending a whole amount of cash, this is also a great time to be thinking very seriously about how do you up the game as a sales and marketing unit? How do you up the game in terms of the company's strategy, in terms of going after your largest accounts at a time frame when they are not buying, but they are listening? Okay, and I think you can build very specific programs for that. And that then needs to tie back into your product roadmap so that you're ready when you're coming out on the other side. And I think a lot of this can be done very economically. But what I see happen in many companies is this entire hunker down mentality where you're really sitting down and waiting for the tide to come back in. At which point in time, when the markets open up, I think you're often at a disadvantage because you haven't been proactive in the time leading up to it.
Right. When the seas are rough, the fisherman goes back and repairs the nets and maybe makes new nets. Bala, thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful discussion. I think we can go on for hours and hours like we usually do, but I think the format just does not allow us to go beyond this time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thanks, Bala, again.
Thanks, Amit. We'll catch up. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.